Hi there, this is Solitary Ronan from Solitary Ronan Films, and welcome to our random review. Today we go to 1952 and Fritz Lang's Rancho Notorious, starring Marlene Dietrich, Arthur Kennedy and Mel Ferrer, with a nice little turn from Jack Elam, who obviously was in lots of westerns. This is just a DVD. It is available on Warner Archive Blu-ray, which I'll probably pick up at some point, but definitely not a 4K if it ever turns up. This is an interesting little western. There were production problems as Fritz Lang and Marlene Dietrich didn't really get on, and Howard Hughes, the studio head at the time, had to intervene a few times. It is 86 minutes, so it's quite short, and you wonder whether it was cut a little bit, but it is absolutely wonderful. As I say, it's Fritz Lang's last western, and it might be one of his last really good films. It kind of messes with some of the stereotypes in westerns, in the sense that Marlene Dietrich is the focus of the story and she's actually in charge, so very much like Barbara Stanwyck and Sam Fuller's 40 Guns, or obviously Joan Crawford and Mercedes McCambridge, and Nicholas Ray's Johnny Guitar. It's actually the female that drives the story instead of standing by her man and looking frightened in gingham, which is in the vast majority of westerns. So the story opens with a ridiculously positive Arthur Kennedy and his fiancée in mid-smooch. I mean, what a way to start a film. And he's going to go off and do some horsey things with cattle, and she's left to look after the haberdashery and sort the gingham into alphabetical order, until a rather salubrious pair of characters come into town. The town's really quiet because everybody's away visiting somebody who had triplets. I'm assuming that's children and not calves. And one of the salubrious characters goes in to the general store haberdashery and has the contents of the safe in his mind, but he's also got the contents of Arthur Kennedy's fiancee's person in his mind, which is never blatantly said. This is 1952 after all, but it's pretty obvious by Lang's close-ups of certain objects and hands. We just hear what goes on. We hear screams from the perspective of a child who's kind of left behind and just playing in the streets because all his pals have left him. So interestingly, Lang chooses to shoot it almost from a child's perspective of hearing screams and then gunshots. And when Arthur Kennedy comes back, he's faced with the truth by the doctor that, you know, she felt the full brunt, or she wasn't spared anything, which is obviously 1950s code for she was taken advantage of before she was shot. But again, we get a couple of really powerful close-ups. The brooch that Arthur Kennedy gave his fiancée has been ripped off from her collar, exposing her neck, and we get a slow little camera move down to her hand, which is almost clenched. No, not clenched, but it's almost like a claw and we can kind of tell exactly what's happened without going full straw dogs. So needless to say, Arthur Kennedy is screaming for vengeance, as Judas Priest might say, and they form a posse to go after these people because the small boys told them, given them a rough description, but it is the West, so everybody kind of looks the same. But once they get to a certain point, the sheriff's like, this is the end of my jurisdiction, and all the other townspeople, as usual, are like, oh, I'm tired. It was your wife, a lot of solidarity by the community, obviously. So Arthur Kennedy's left on his own to try and track down the murderer and the sexual predator and attacker. So the bad man, in typical bad man fashion, instead of halving the loot from the robbery, just shoots his sidekick in the back, as bad men tend to do, and Arthur Kennedy gets him just before he dies, and he just utters the word "chuck-a-luck," which unfortunately we are made aware of in the opening titles, because unfortunately Rancho Notorious does have one of the worst theme songs or title songs in Western history, and that's saying something, because if you've seen a lot of Westerns, you probably know what I mean. Some of the opening title songs are absolutely atrocious, but "Chuck-a-Luck" may take the biscuit. So Arthur Kennedy goes in a nice montage trying to find out who or what is Chuck-a-Luck, apart from a very bad title song. So eventually he's in a barber shop, and for some reason the barber is doing two men at a time, or giving them haircuts at the same time. And George Kennedy, I knew I would say George Kennedy at one point. Arthur Kennedy says, "Oh, have you ever heard of Chuck-a-Luck, or somebody called Chuck-a-Luck?" And the other man who's being done by the barber looks at him in a funny manner and asks the barber for another towel, and then a massive fight ensues, and it turns out the other guy is an outlaw. So Arthur Kennedy's at first arrested, but then thanked and given the reward for helping to capture this outlaw, which he gives the reward to the barber because he's got vengeance in his mind. He's not bothered about $300 in cash. And then it kind of goes into an interesting section where, again, we get montages of Arthur Kennedy going from town to town asking people about Chuck-a-Luck, and it turns out that it is this kind of Rancho Notorious where outlaws hang out, and of course it's run by Marlene Dietrich's character, and you hear stories about her, so very much like Marlene Dietrich herself, what's true and what's false, and all the legends and myths about her. We even see a flashback of her riding one of the characters in a bar game, Men as Horses, which is interesting because it's usually women as objects in westerns. So eventually Arthur Kennedy meets up with Frenchie, played by Mel Ferrer, who's in jail for something or other, and he helps Frenchie get out, and they go to Chuck-a-Luck. I think that'll be the last time I say Chuck-a-Luck. I'll be referring it to Rancho Notorious from now on. And there he meets Marlene Dietrich's character and all these ruffians and outlaws, including the wonderful Jack Elam, of course, but some other familiar faces, including the bad man who did bad things to Arthur Kennedy's fiancée. And there's little clues, and there's even George Reeves, is that his name, who went on to play Superman, or had previously played Superman, I can't remember. I think it was after this was Superman, maybe. So it then becomes a detective film for a little while, where Arthur Kennedy is trying to pick up clues of who did the bad things to his wife. And there's clues on Dietrich's person, there's clues in people's behaviour. And that's probably where I'll just leave the plot. There's twists and turns, suspicions, and people get jealous of certain other people. And it all ends up with people reassessing their lives and everybody at the end of the film being alone, which is quite wonderful. There's no real happy endings, unless you actually read the whole film as a gay love story between Arthur Kennedy and Mel Ferrer. Then I suppose it's sort of a happy ending, but everybody's alone at the end. Perhaps people have learned their lessons, but not really. It's one of those films where you kind of wish the protagonist would perhaps have told Dietrich the truth earlier, but I suppose for dramatic purposes that didn't happen. But everybody's on top of their game. Dietrich's fantastic. This and Destry Rides Again gives you two kind of different spectrums of Dietrich and westerns. And Arthur Kennedy, there's some nice close-up shots of him, you know, sweating with pure vengeance rage. And when the penny drops and he finds out who's actually responsible, that's rather nice as well. Elam gets a couple of nice moments, but again, he was always the third heavy to the left, but he still gets some decent time. Lang does have some of his kind of trademark close-ups of objects and close-ups of parts of people's bodies for dramatic punch. And again, it's only 86 minutes, but strangely enough it flies along, and it's just kind of awesome. As I said, I'll probably pick up the Blu-ray. I just picked up the DVD cheap just to see what it was like, because at the time I didn't actually realise there was a Blu-ray. I don't know whether it's fairly recent in Warner Archive. I think it is just a US release, but the good thing about Warner Archive is most of them are actually multi-region. But yes, absolutely wonderful. We can always do a bit more Dietrich, because her character does go through a change, and she does the looking glamorous in bits and then looking cool wearing jeans and a shirt, as she kind of did throughout her entire career. And again, into some respects, this is almost a film about Dietrich's myth and Dietrich's kind of what's true and what's not about her. And it's just another interesting kind of female-led western where all these outlaws come to her to stay, to hide out, and she takes her cut of their ill-gotten gains. And there's rules like there's no questions, you know, nobody asks anybody their past or where they're going or where they've been, as long as they pay, which of course is a nice little statement on capitalism itself. So thanks very much for watching this random review of Fritz Lang's Rancho Notorious with the wonderful Marlene Dietrich and Arthur Kennedy, not George Kennedy. And hopefully you'll join me again for more random reviews. Please let me know if you've seen Rancho Notorious and what you think of it. And hopefully you'll join me again for more random reviews. This is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films saying farewell.